Merci beaucoup. On va passer aux questions de la salle. On a un quart d'heure, je crois. C'est ça? Très bien, un quart d'heure. Madame?
Ah, oui, aux États-Unis, il y a une organisation qui s'appelle Southern Poverty Law Center et qui a par elle-même mis sur ses genoux le Ku Klux Klan. C'est-à-dire que ce n'est pas le gouvernement qui l'a fait, mais une organisation privée d'avocats et qui a travaillé et qui a réussi et qui continue à travailler sur tout un tas de groupes d'extrême droite en faisant simplement des procès et en ayant mis le Ku Klux Klan sur ses genoux et par terre au niveau argent, parce que, en gagnant tous les procès, et ils ont perdu tout leur argent, toute leur propriété, etc. Ce qui fait qu'ils n'ont plus été capables de fonctionner. Et je pense qu'on n'a pas en Europe un système comme ça. On attend que les gouvernements le fassent. Et en fait, on peut très bien le faire. Et je pense qu'en Israël, ils ont commencé un petit peu à le faire aussi au niveau des avocats. Et je pense que c'est un système qui est absolument extraordinaire, qui est reproducible, qui n'est pas sans danger, puisque les personnes qui ont commencé ont des gardes à vie. Mais il y a eu aussi une bombe qui a explosé en 1973. Mais malgré ça, c'est quelque chose qui a réussi, qui fait beaucoup de recherches. Et voilà, je donne cette question, voilà, qui n'est pas gouvernementale.
Yes, and it's a huge thing in the US, and it's getting obviously much more traction post October 7th. So the US passed a law some 25 years ago called the ATA, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which basically holds civilly liable anybody that has provided support to terrorism. So you go to federal court, but it's civil. You get sued by people who have US ties, and you sue entities. It could be governments, it could be any kind of actor that has provided support. And it's been used quite a bit. And it brings massive, US court style damages. So the landmark case there, just to give people an idea, because it's very different from a European perspective. It doesn't exist. You're perfectly right that something like that doesn't exist in Europe, although I think it would be interesting to have a conversation in different countries about it. Family of an American kid who was killed by Hamas in Jerusalem in '97 sued a variety of entities, Chicago-based, which were considered to be raising funds for Hamas in the United States. And after a very, very lengthy trial, they were found guilty and sentenced to $156 million. Now, what happened though, we go back to what I was saying about organizations. Guess what these organizations did? The next day, they dissolved, they declared bankrupt, and we said, there's no money, there's nothing. Guess what? 6 months later, they had recreated themselves, and slight change in name. I run a program called Program on Extremism. It's like if I declare bankrupt and tomorrow I create a project on extremism. Same people, same everything, so now new trial. Now, so it's always a challenge, it's difficult. Having said so, it is still very good because it creates a lot of problem to these entities. It keeps them busy. It still damages because costs in the US for trials are high. It exposes them. There's a process in the States called discovery, which means if you and I go to trial, I can ask a lot of information about you. I can get your emails dating back 5 years, all of them. And so you find out a lot of stuff. So the other side does it too. There's, of course, a lot of lawfare going on in the States and in the UK, in which Islamist actors sue, but it's also happening the other way around. But yeah.
Question courte, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, please. Yes, please. My question is to Serjan. 1990, Soviet Union fall, and diplomatic academic, all was very, very interesting what is happening in future. And we get two current. Fukuyama, the end of the war, and end of the idea camp, and the second one, as you know, clash of the civilization, and Samuel Huntington. Now, the question is very clear, yes or no? Is it time now to put end for Fukuyama?
I think you'd have to ask Fukuyama that. I mean, he says that he's been misunderstood when he talked about the end of history. I mean, it's a sort of Hegelian thesis, which went a bit wrong. I mean, 1990 it was not only the fall of the Soviet Union, it was also the end of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And that was the turning point, actually, for the Saudis in the way that they understood the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, because they had not understood that the Brotherhood, because of course the Brotherhood over Kuwait, so we always talk about the International Muslim Brotherhood. Actually, the International Muslim Brotherhood were in action then. They sent a delegation line with Ghanouchi, Turabi, Yusuf Nada, and a variety of other people. And this is the International Muslim Brotherhood. And their answer was, make this an Islamic solution and to hell with Kuwait, which, excuse my language, pissed the Saudis off massively. And it was then they realized that the Ikhwan had Salafized themselves. There had been the Tastelfanat al-Ikhwan and the Ta'akhwan al-Salafiyya. It was an interest which had been actually happening since the 1970s. And that was the thing that actually turned the Saudis against the Brotherhood in particular, also against what became known as the Sahwa. And it shaped the way that the Kuwaitis and indeed the Emiratis saw all of this. So it was an inflection point. Do I think history has ended? No. I'm not here to defend Francis Fukuyama.
Allez-y.
Bon, oui, bonjour. Putain, c'est terrible. Je voulais parler de mon cas parce que moi, je m'appelle William Richier, j'ai créé un site internet. J'ai été professeur
une question courte.
Oui,
15
une
ans.
question très, très courte,
Voilà, j'ai été révoqué de la fonction publique pour avoir dénoncé l'emprise des frères musulmans. Et ça a déplu à monsieur Boris Belmou-Eudes. Ils sont très influents au sein de l'éducation nationale et je peux vous dire que le ministère les soigne.
Merci pour ce témoignage. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Monsieur, au fond. Très court, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci. Merci aux intervenants des différentes sessions pour cet échange d'expériences et ces vues croisées. Une question, selon vous, puisque vous êtes, pour l'intégrité de vous, engagé dans des analyses, dans des recherches universitaires, quels sont les thèmes qui restent encore à étudier et quel serait le rôle justement des centres de recherche et des universités en général par rapport aux défis qui sont posés par l'islamisme en Europe, mais qui est également un problème global?
On va peut-être prendre 2 questions en plus, comme ça on répond à toutes les questions en même temps, s'il vous plaît. Messieurs, oui.
Oui, un mot n'a pas été prononcé depuis ce matin, c'est celui d'immigration. Ce n'est pas une obsession chez moi, mais c'est une variable importante du problème, de la problématique en tout cas politique, parce que la démocratie a à voir avec la démographie. Ma question est la suivante, c'est, on parle des musulmans modérés, et je me tourne, c'est plutôt une question pour Lorenzo, je pense, mais est-ce que c'est un levier d'activer la communauté musulmane en général pour la mettre en porte-à-faux avec les frères musulmans et les autres organisations islamistes, comme on peut s'y prendre? Et parce que honnêtement, ils prennent très peu la parole. La dernière fois qu'ils ont pris la parole, le CFCM, c'était pour tacler Florence, pour leur dire qu'elle avait tort de parler d'islamosphère et de frérisme. Alors, je pense que c'est une clé du problème et j'aimerais bien avoir votre opinion là-dessus.
Très bien. Et une dernière question, monsieur.
Oui, Pascal Robin, je suis ancien délégué du préfet du Val d'Oise. Juste pour dire qu'il y a un intérêt à parler des interventions sur ces questions-là dans les établissements scolaires. autour de ce qu'on appelle notamment les valeurs de la République et la citoyenneté. Je l'ai fait, moi, en lien avec l'éducation nationale. Il y a des enjeux majeurs en la matière et je pense qu'on devrait développer ce sujet.
Très bien. Alors, 3 questions. Quelles sont les voies de recherche? Quid de l'immigration et quid de l'intervention dans les milieux scolaires?
Je voudrais bien commencer avec la question au sujet des recherches qui devraient être menées encore à ce sujet. Et puis, j'ai l'impression qu'en fait, on parle beaucoup de frérisme, que même maintenant, on a beaucoup de contributions, surtout aussi de Lorenzo et bien d'autres qui ont déjà parlé aujourd'hui, en ce qui concerne les frères musulmans aussi dans les pays européens. Ce qui nous manque, par contre, c'est le Hizb ut-Tahrir. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de recherches là-dessus. Par exemple, il y a d'autres aussi organisations qui sont sous-recherchées. Il y a trop peu de recherches dessus par des organisations islamistes. Et de l'autre côté, évidemment, l'extrémisme de gauche. Parce que là, on s'arrête aux années 90, j'ai l'impression, et le lien entre les deux.
Vous voulez intervenir sur les questions sur l'immigration notamment?
Yeah, very briefly. Obviously, that's a major component. You know, we have so far talked about a problem that has existed here for a long time. We're talking about networks that have existed in Europe for 50, 60 years. You know, people who come, people who have recently come to Europe, they come from all walks of life, all ideological perspectives. I think from an Islamist point of view, they constitute a massive opportunity. You know, go back to the concept of what Qaradawi said in his book about, you know, the West being an Islamic tabula rasa. People come to the West, and there's an ability for these networks to influence these newcomers who are understandably, you know, confused, just arrived, new country, new society, conflict of identities. That is the perfect moment for Islamist groups to take advantage of. More than anecdotally, I think in Germany there's been a lot of stories like that in the media of you know, newcomers to Germany who are shocked to go to mosques and say this stuff we would never see it back in Syria or the countries we come from, but they're very mainstream in German mosques. So on some level we actually at the paradoxical point in which it's more radical, the stuff that it's here already, rather than you know, many of the people who come in. Now, there's no question then, but from a security point of view, there have been some connections between migration and, I mean, the Paris November 2015 attacks is a perfect case study of flawed migration policies and enforcement and with a security implication. But from an Islamist point of view, and in fact, it is not surprising that one of the issues they work on the most and they try to get grants on is integration of newcomers. But it's not just because of the money they get through it, but it's the ability to work on people who come without connections and therefore in sort of identity crisis and make them more potentially susceptible to their ideology.
And the role of the moderate Muslim organization, Lorenzo, how could we activate the so-called moderate Muslim organization?
First of all, the whole moderate radical is always very tricky definition. Yeah, of course, we're simplifying things. Because most of them are not organizations. Because the imbalance, there's an enormous imbalance when it comes to structure. Of course, there's big effort there, and there's a lot of smaller entities of Muslim that do some great work. Absolutely. I think that's particularly true at the local level. So it's not like this is not happening. It is happening, of course. The problem is always in the imbalance of resources and the fact that, you know, you see it, and I've spoken at times with literally the people who, you know, rubber stamp the grants, make decision on what entity to have. You're often going to find Islamists will have a better application from a very neutral point of view. A better budget, they look more structured, they've been around longer. If you're a bureaucrat who doesn't know about Islamism, different currents, Tablighi, Brotherhood, and so on, very complicated stuff, you simply approve the grant, you decide what organization is going to work, is going to get the money, municipality so-and-so to run religious services for the newcomers. based just on very dry budgetary factors. And generally speaking, Islamists are better placed. They sort of outprice the other because they punch low. So often that's the dynamic. But it is happening quite a bit. We go back to the idea that one should have an assessment that goes beyond the dry numbers.
Okay, très vite, très court. A moderate radical extreme, I don't like it all in the Islamic context. I mean, they themselves will use the word wasatiyya. Wasatiyya, of course, comes from a surah of the Quran, which talks about the best community. And actually, nobody quite knows what it means in the Quranic context. And we use it all the time. It's imposing our taxonomies in something which is not actually susceptible to Western definitions. The second thing is universities and research. And this goes back to Susanna's point. I think there has been a collective trahison des clercs in universities over the last 30 to 40 years. Because certainly in the UK, if there is an ecosystem of anything, it's an ecosystem of activism against governmental policy. People all see themselves as Fanonistes or Qutbists who actually reject. So we've had this campaign against the contest, the prevent strategy. It is all over British universities. Turning this around is going to be a real problem because everybody is embedded. So it's 30 to 40 years, I think, you're talking about to change this ecosystem. And the first thing you need to do is to get proper vice-chancellors into universities who are tough-minded. So if anybody wants me, I'm available.
Merci beaucoup. Et donc je laisse la parole à Florence pour la dernière session.
Merci beaucoup, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for your contributions. It was a difficult exercise to be so understandable with complex topics like this. So I would like to thank you again and ask the public to do an ovation. Bravo.